Okay, great. So to finish therapy, it's 60 pages long, it takes forever. So I just need you two to finish up your city and send them to me. For some reason, everyone isn't linked up to it, but somehow it needs to you all need to do it through the UCLA system, so you're all linked up and up to date on there. So look at the instructions that Jason sent for exactly which things need to be done. Some of you've already done it, so that's good. So it's gonna be hopefully, I mean, I don't know how long it's gonna take to approve once I submit it, but we'll hope for the best. And then we're gonna start, so once you finish all the standard training, we're gonna aim to start scanning maybe November, maybe December, I guess, however long it takes to get the RD approved and to get, our protocol set up and to get everyone standard trained. So that's the goal for that study, that's the bilingualism and autism. So I'll talk more about that once we get sort of approved and get a protocol set up. And I'm going to be gone the October 25th through the 30th for a conference in Amsterdam. So I canceled whatever meetings there are that Friday or Wednesday. But I'm around the rest of the month. Other than that, I think that's it. Are there anything Jason you want to announce about other stuff you've got planned?
I think that's it for now.
Okay.
All the training. So the undergrads again should do the whatever I sent that one module. The other two modules are for people who will be interacting with their demographic data. So that's the reason for that. Undergraduates, unfortunately, you are not allowed to interact with participants, collect their data or any type of health information. So when we scan, you'll just be a helper in the scan. So that's the reason for filling out the first module, and we will talk more about that later. So,
And Jason is setting up monthly meetings.
yeah.
When that is.
So far, it seems like it'll be on Friday. 1 to 2, I think. I will send out an email, but that seems like when.
Okay, so
Most
you figure out what room you can reserve for that time?
Yeah, I'll reserve a room and then we will let everyone know.
Sounds good. And then today we're going to have a presentation from Amanda Baker, who I will let introduce herself and tell us about her background and research interests. Are there any announcements or news things anyone wants to share before we jump into the science? Anyone on Zoom or in the room? Any news or info? All right, then we will get right into it. And let's see, is there someone on the chat saying something? You might want to just shout out because we might not be able to see the chat once we get started. That's, yeah, hope you do feel better. Okay. Yeah, all right, then we can go ahead and get going.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. I'm Amanda Baker. I just finished my PhD in Dr. Adriana Galvan's lab, studying anxiety and risk-taking in the adolescent brain. So over my time in grad school, I really focused on how adolescent brain development kind of gives rise to the development of anxiety and the development of risk-taking in adolescence. And I had the opportunity to also look at how factors such as sleep and stress and entrance to the juvenile justice system affected the associations between these constructs. But today I'm just going to be focusing on the longitudinal portion of my dissertation, which was using data from the DAYS study, which multiple people here are now working on. So I figured that would be relevant, looking at basically how anxiety and risk-taking develop over adolescence. Okay, so anxiety is very common in adolescence. And although there are many anxiety disorders onset in childhood, by the time youth reach adolescence, nearly 1 in 3 individuals will reach clinical criteria for an anxiety disorder. But there are vast individual differences in symptom trajectories, as well as how these symptoms influence behavior. And this heterogeneity is part of the reason that pediatric anxiety disorders are very difficult to diagnose and treat. Okay, so a large body of research has tied anxiety to a heightened attention to threat, coupled with increased avoidant behavior. And so avoidance can kind of provide temporary anxiety relief and can be adaptive in early childhood. But over time, it can become reinforcing and habitual and actually lead to further anxiety development. And these factors make avoidance really one of the cardinal symptoms of anxiety that contributes to a lot of interference in these disorders. Okay, so this is compounded by the fact that in adolescence, subcortical, oops, no, sorry, wrong slide. So this is especially problematic in adolescence, which is a developmental phase in which youth often show adaptive increases in risk-taking that serve to promote exploration, learning, and goal-directed behavior in preparation for adult independence. And this conflict with regular typical adolescent development is another reason why anxiety might often develop at this life stage. Okay, so this is compounded by the fact that in adolescence, subcortical regions that signal valence and salience, such as the striatum and amygdala, are hypersensitive to stimuli. And at the same time, regulatory systems in the prefrontal cortex are still maturing. Along with connections from the prefrontal cortex to these subcortical hubs, and direct connections from the amygdala to the striatum. So according to the triadic model of adolescent motivated behavior, these three regions make up approach, avoidance, and regulatory neural systems that together really control responses to positive and aversive cues. And so while studies of adolescent risk-taking often focus on the reward-sensitive striatum and the prefrontal cortex, studies of adolescent anxiety often focus on the threat-sensitive amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. However, the story is not that simple. So the striatum has also been implicated in avoidance and in aversive learning. And animal models actually suggest that once avoidance becomes kind of habitual or maladaptive, it might actually forego the amygdala and really correlate with activity in the striatum and the prelimbic cortex or the dorsal anterior cingulate in humans. So it is possible that while this striatal sensitivity and frontostriatal mechanisms might promote approach behaviors in typical adolescent development, it's possible that these same mechanisms might function to promote avoidance in youth with anxiety. So studying one of these regions in isolation can tell only part of the story. So for my dissertation, I really wanted to focus on all three of these regions and how they interact and compete to influence both risk-taking, avoidance, and anxiety development. Okay, so when does anxiety interfere with decision-making? So in situations where there's clear imminent harm, such as threat avoidance, harm avoidance, a certain degree of anxiety can be beneficial due to the increased kind of attention to threat and vigilance. And as we know, in adolescence, response inhibition and this kind of inhibitory control is also very important for safety and development in situations such as this, like stopping at a red light. On the other hand, in situations involving risky decision-making, where there's uncertainty, approach avoidance conflict, anxiety can interfere with this type of decision-making. And interestingly, in adolescents are uniquely tolerant of ambiguity and actually prefer to take risks when the outcomes are unknown. On the other hand, anxiety is kind of characterized by this intolerance of uncertainty. So studying how anxiety and risk-taking develop together is an important next step to really understand both healthy and pathological trajectories. And really the field has mostly studied risk-taking and anxiety and the development of this in adolescence pretty separately. So there's not a lot of information about how these two things develop together. Okay, so here my main research questions were to look at, do adolescents with worsening anxiety symptoms exhibit markers of maladaptive avoidance during risky decision-making? And then also, as we saw that the maladaptive avoidance might involve the amygdala less and the VS more, do the amygdala and striatum interact during risk avoidance to predict kind of the development of clinical anxiety in adolescents? Okay, so for this, I wanted to look at different types of avoidance. So kind of this harm avoidance or just inhibitory control, and then also risk avoidance, which is voluntary, involves approach avoidance conflict, is really more decision making rather than this instructed avoidance here. So for this, we needed a task that measured avoidance across both risk-taking and response inhibition conditions. So that's what we used in this study. So you've probably seen some version of the driving game, also called the stoplight task. This is a simulated driving game, and this game begins with 2 to 4 randomly presented green lights. So the participant will see these green lights. They're told to go at green lights. They press 1 to go. And then half the time after these green lights, they'll see a red light in which they're instructed just stop as quickly as you can. And half the time they'll see a yellow light. And at the yellow lights, they're told you can either choose to stop or go. At a red light, if you choose to stop, it just turns red. If you accidentally choose to go, a false alarm, you crash, which adds a delay to your route. And for the yellow lights, if you decide to stop, it adds just a 3-second delay to your route. And if you decide to go, make a risky choice, 50% of the time you'll make it to the other side, getting this little money sign on the screen, getting to the finish line faster. And 50% of the time you'll crash, which adds a 6-second delay to the route. So here we really focused on kind of these inhibitory conditions. So this instructed inhibition and this voluntary cautious choice. And I'm not going to present results from the cross-sectional part of my dissertation, which was really looking at year 1. But here we found some interesting things with anxiety, such that youth with anxiety took the same amount of risk, or with higher anxiety, took the same amount of risks as their peers, but they took a lot longer during cautious decision-making, where, well, they were faster during instructed inhibition. So that kind of suggests that this approach avoidance conflict that's inherent in the voluntary cautious choice is kind of interfering with decision-making in anxiety. Okay, so participants for this study came from the Development of Anxiety in Youth study. So at the time I did these analyses, we had 106 participants who had come in at year 1. They were 9 to 13 years old at year 1. They came in for a scan and a clinical interview and behavioral assessments, and then they came back for their follow-up. And so we were interrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic, as many people were. So about half our sample had already come in for their year 2 visit before the pandemic, and then the other half came in after the pandemic. I know there's not really an after the pandemic, but after the shutdown, they came in. So that's why we had this kind of 1.3 years in between these visits.
Built-in intervention that probably increased anxiety.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, so that's really interesting. And we also, it's a 3-year longitudinal study. So I was supposed to have the 3 years in my dissertation, but because of the delay, I don't. But we are still finishing up collecting that year 3, and then at that point they'll all be post-pandemic. So there will be some interesting things to look at there. And this is just the breakdown. It was a pretty diverse sample, and we had 60 males and then the rest were females. Okay, and so for measures for anxiety, we used the Screen for Child Anxiety Related Disorders, or the SCARED. We had both parent report and child report on this, but we proposed to use the child report. And then we also had the ADIS, so all participants went through a clinician interview, and they were given a kind of clinician rated severity score that was really their kind of official diagnosis, whereas the SCARED was supposed to measure anxiety dimensionally. And then I'll talk about this a little bit today. We also had many different individual difference measures, but the one that I focused on here is this adolescent decision-making questionnaire. And so it's just a questionnaire that asks basically about your approach to decision-making. So there's kind of I've split it up into these 2 components. There's this positive component. So that involves items such as, I'm confident in my decisions. I really like making decisions. I feel good about my decision after I've made it. I pay close attention to my decisions. And then there's kind of this negative component, which is comprised of items such as I put off making decisions until it's too late, or I like other people to make my decisions for me, or I panic when I'm making decisions. So we collected that at each time point as well.
Is it like decisions in general, or decisions in some context?
Yeah, it was just in general. So the form says like just rate how true these are for you, and there's these different items, and so it was just pretty open-ended decision making. Okay, so here I was thinking about this, and I was thinking, okay, so when does avoidance become a problem? So we know that avoidance kind of becomes a problem, especially for anxiety and for adolescents, when it becomes kind of reinforcing, habitual. You're not really thinking about, you're not really maybe conflict processing, thinking about the approach avoidance conflict. Maybe it's just kind of habitual, just automatic avoidance. And as we also had learned before, maybe there's this difference between amygdala and striatal function in avoidance based on whether it's kind of reached this habitual level or if it still involves this approach avoidance conflict. So here I hypothesize that perhaps this kind of maladaptive avoidance and this development of anxiety over time might show up as similarity in brain response between kind of this voluntary cautious decision, this goal-directed behavior, and this instructed inhibition. So I hypothesize that maybe over time, the adolescents who worsened in anxiety would start to show kind of more neural generalization across these two different avoidance conditions, suggesting maybe a shift towards maladaptive or habitual avoidance away from goal-directed behavior. So here I just lay that out. So yes, I hypothesize that maybe these two would become more similar in youth who increase in anxiety, while cautious and risky choices would become more distinct. And this might indicate that this cautious decision making is really turning more into kind of just automatic avoidance. And then I also wanted to specifically kind of look at regions involved in conflict processing to see, okay, how is kind of the development of anxiety and risk taking related to how much conflict processing is going on during these cautious choices. So for this, I used a meta-analysis of 337 studies on neurosynth, and I just downloaded this conflict map. So these are regions that are active, particularly in response to conflict. And these are the regions here. So really centered in the dorsal anterior cingulate with some insula and thalamus in there too. And so I also wanted to compare this to cautious choices and kind of see how neural conflict processing during risk avoidance was related to both symptoms and behavior. Okay, so starting in on just some behavioral results that we found. So here is just a table of the year 1, year 2, and then the difference between these two. So we actually found in this sample that this child scared, the self-report anxiety went down between year 1 and year 2 on average. Some kiddos did increase, but on average, it actually went down. And then we found that this clinician-rated anxiety went up. So that was a discrepancy that was interesting, and I looked into that a little bit that I'll get onto the next slide. Then we also saw that there was this increase in risk-taking behaviors from time 1 to time 2, a trend in increase in false alarms, and then they also answered more on the GO trials. And then overall, all participants got faster at this decision-making over time. Okay, so here just going into that discrepancy between scared and CGIS, which is the clinician-rated severity at year 2. So there's this group of participants where the clinician was rating them as pretty high. So three is like the cutoff for you have low-grade anxiety, and so these kiddos here were getting rated pretty high and higher than year one. But when I was looking into their scared, a lot of them just, denied all symptoms. And so I looked at some of the clinician interviews, and some of them did indicate that the participants themselves just denied everything. But then when they talked to the parent, they heard about a lot more. So that's something interesting that we'll have to look into, especially now that we have the year 3 data. And it'll be interesting also to kind of look at that with the parents scared as well. But it was an interesting discrepancy in our data that we weren't really predicting there.
It's actually like surprising to me that for anxiety, they don't use physiological responses clinically, because I mean, in a lot of disorders, you can't just get a skin response that is elevated, but in this, like, you probably can, right? So, that would be a more objective marker than just like the self-report. But I mean, it always surprises me that DSM doesn't use any biology to, like, when it would be obviously clinically useful. Like in this case, the discrepancy might be resolved by looking at something like this. I mean, you guys are clinicians know more about this, but I mean, isn't there a ton of literature about, physiological responses to stress that would have been relevant?
Sure, but I think it's really difficult to identify the specific stressor that's going to cause that, as well as get the kid to be in the room with that stressor.
Right.
So, insight is one thing that a lot of people talk about when it comes to anxiety in kids. That grouping, that's a bit unexpected, because they're potentially doing so much avoidance that they don't think they have any anxiety. They never experience anxiety because
So they're not
avoidance
putting
is all they
themselves
do.
in the situation, or they're removing themselves from it.
It's become such a habit.
Yeah, totally. And I was looking too at some of the, because on the scared, one of the subcategories is like significant school avoidance. And a lot of the questions there, when I was looking at, like, if you imagine, like, let's say you've been in the pandemic shutdown for a couple months or something, and it's like, in the past, however long, how much do you hate going to school? Do you avoid like going into school and all these things? So also part of it might have been impacted by the pandemic, and that kind of shifted things around. So it'll be really interesting to look at that third time point and see how it looks there. Okay, so what? Oh, yes. Okay, so change in anxiety and scared was not associated with change in risk-taking behaviors. And we found this at year 1, too, where anxiety was not significantly associated with degree of risk-taking on this task. And participants clustered into these 3 main groups. So the first one here kind of decreased in anxiety, and then like decreased or no change in risk-taking. This group here increased in risk-taking and kind of decreased in anxiety. And then this group here kind of showed no change, kind of increases or decreases in risk-taking and increases in anxiety. So there really wasn't a one-to-one mapping over time. And I think that's important, because a lot of people assume, oh, anxious people are just going to be really risk averse and not take any risks. But we have not found that in this sample. And yeah, in my work with some of the cross-sectional data, I found some interesting things with adolescent approach motivations kind of interacting with the association between anxiety and risk-taking. So maybe there's these other individual difference factors like reward sensitivity or sensation seeking that really make a difference with how anxious adolescents take risks. Okay, and then although there was no association with change in behavior, if you'll remember, I said everyone got faster over time, but the youth with anxiety actually took longer and longer at these yellow light trials over time. So the youth with lower anxiety got faster at everything. The youth with higher anxiety got faster at the inhibition, the instructed trials, but did not get faster at the risk taking. So there's something about this kind of approach avoidance conflict and the uncertainty inherent in risky decision making that is relating to anxiety, even if the behavior itself isn't.
Which anxiety was that?
Yeah, this is the scared. So this is the scared. I would use the scared in most things until the end. I kind of tried to see if anything predicted kind of the clinical anxiety, but this was scared. And this was also, we found this at time 1 where scared was really tightly associated with taking longer at yellow lights compared to red lights. So it looks like that just kind of continues over development.
So there was no association with the clinical?
No, there was no association with the clinical. The clinical also just has a much, let's see if I can, it's, you know, it doesn't have as big a range. So, and it was more just categorical. So that might have been part of it, but a lot of the associations showed weak associations with the clinical. They showed stronger with the scared, but clinical, the clinician related rated anxiety was also not associated with risk taking over time. Okay, cool. And then we had that that adolescent decision making questionnaire where they rated, you know, their kind of approach to decision making. And at time one, we had found that anxiety was tightly associated with negatively associated with those kind of positive approaches to decision making, and very tightly positively associated with the negative approaches. So here I looked at that over time. So how does this change in scared relate to change in these perceptions? And here with positive, we saw that the adolescents who increased in scared reported fewer of these kind of positive, I feel confident in my decisions, I like making decisions. And then they showed increases in these negative approaches to decision making. So even though they weren't showing these behavioral kind of frequency of behavior, associations with frequency of behaviors, they were reporting that they didn't like making decisions or didn't feel good about their decisions. And they also kind of took longer when in those decision-making trials. Okay, so moving on to that neural similarity hypothesis that I wanted to look at. And I will qualify this by saying that this task does not, because it has both this inhibitory control condition and the risky decision-making. And then obviously the risky decision-making is contingent on participant response. There's not a ton of trials in each of these conditions. So, so future work, I really want to look at this with more trials and more participants, but this is kind of just some preliminary findings. Okay, so here I created this inhibitory index, which was basically looking at how neural similarity between change in neural similarity between cautious and inhibition compared to neural similarity between cautious and risky. So here I looked at, okay, so over time, do these kind of voluntary cautious choices move towards and move closer in similarity to these voluntary risky approach behaviors, or move closer in similarity to this kind of instructed instructed avoidance, where this wouldn't really involve decision making. So to do this, I just used this function 3D dot in AFNI. I feel like there are probably better ways to do this, but this was how I figured it out here.
So that's just whole brain.
Exactly. So I used whole brain, and since then I've started to look more at within ROIs, and there's probably more you know, kind of significant stuff. But here I was just thinking, okay, just whole brain activation, kind of this pattern of the activation, is it kind of generalizing more across cautious and inhibition, or generalizing more here? And I kind of thought, okay, maybe if you know, if youth with anxiety are kind of moving towards more of this maladaptive automatic avoidance, they would start showing this kind of neural generalization across voluntary cautious choices and instructed inhibition, whereas maybe kind of like the increase in risk-taking that often happens in adolescence, maybe it is more associated with kind of neural generalization across approach and avoidance behaviors in the context of risk and reward. And so here, what I found is that the youth that increased in anxiety in scared showed more and more neural similarity between cautious and inhibition compared to risky and cautious. So cautious moved this direction, and these were all in the same model. So risk-taking and anxiety were in the same model here. And then risk-taking frequency was associated with more and more kind of neural generalization across risky and cautious moved further and further away from inhibition. And actually at time one, I also found an association between scared score and this neural generalization between cautious and inhibition. And I also found an association between risk-taking frequency and generalization across these two. Okay, cool. And And then next, I wanted to do that same kind of analysis, but just looking at similarity to this conflict processing map. So here I looked at, created this conflict index, which is just looking at, does cautious become more or less similar to this conflict map? Again, using whole brain here in the cautious trials, but I should try it with just the dorsal anterior singular, because I really feel like that's what's really driving this conflict processing map here. So here, once again, I find that here in the youth that increased in the scared score, they showed less and less conflict processing during cautious trials, risk avoidance over time. Then on the other hand, increases in risk taking were associated with kind of more and more conflict processing during this cautious choice. So even though we're not seeing these behavioral differences in anxiety, we were seeing these kind of neural shifts where the changes based on anxiety were kind of opposing the changes based on risk taking. Okay, cool. And then next, here I wanted to just look at whole brain neural connectivity of the striatum and the amygdala during this cautious choice or risk avoidance. And I used beta series correlation analysis to do this. And because I was looking across two different seeds, I corrected for multiple comparisons there. And I included basically both change in anxiety and change in risk taking as covariates in the same model. So for both striatal connectivity during risk avoidance and amygdala connectivity, I wanted to see how these change in these two factors relate to change in connectivity. So what I found here actually was really interesting. When I was looking at striatal connectivity, looking during cautious choice, what I found was a significant association with change in anxiety, actually with change in scared, and not with change in risk taking. So in youth who increased in anxiety over time, they showed more and more connectivity between the striatum and the dorsal anterior cingulate, the thalamus, a lot of these regions that were kind of popping up in the conflict map there over time. And as we talked about at the beginning, this kind of maladaptive avoidance in the animal models suggests that it might involve the striatum and the dorsal anterior cingulate more so than the amygdala. So that was an interesting thing here, might have to do with that. And also this again kind of showed that like just focusing on this, the amygdala when studying anxiety might not get the whole story, because here we're actually seeing these associations with striatal connectivity over time. And there were no associations between change in risk taking and striatal connectivity during risk avoidance. So once again, if you were just studying, the striatum and risk taking, you might not get that side of the story. And now looking at these changes in kind of amygdala connectivity during cautious choice. So here using this amygdala seed, again, during risk avoidance, I actually found that here, when looking at amygdala connectivity, we found associations with change in risk taking, but not in change in anxiety. So here, increases in risk taking over time were associated with increases in amygdala connectivity with kind of these motor and sensory areas. And then increases in risk taking were associated with decreases in amygdala connectivity with the prefrontal cortex. And again, anxiety was in this model and showed no associations with amygdala connectivity during risk avoidance. So this was just an interesting kind of another piece of evidence that these regions, don't have modular functions and both play a role in these parts of adolescent development. Okay, so then finally, I wanted to use that clinician rated anxiety since we did see that increased over time. I just wanted to see how do the amygdala and striatum kind of interact during avoidance, and how does this maybe predict clinical anxiety? So as we talked about before, the maladaptive avoidance might involve actually less of the amygdala and more of the ventral striatum. And so I wanted to look at kind of whether this marker of maladaptive avoidance might be associated with the development of clinical anxiety over time. So here, again, using this cautious choice, the cautious choices were kind of the hero of my dissertation that I focused on a lot. And a lot of the participants, they took mostly cautious choices, so there were a lot more cautious trials. But also it just ended up being really interesting kind of to focus on with anxiety, because it's this idea of avoidance, but not necessarily maladaptive avoidance, depending on other factors. Okay, so first, I wanted to look, okay, so does year one amygdala response during these cautious decisions interact with year one striatal response to predict year two clinician rated anxiety severity? And this was controlling for year two amygdala response and year two BS response and year one anxiety severity. And here I found that yes, it did. So here in this group, basically, if you showed low year one amygdala response coupled with high striatal response during risk avoidance, those were the kiddos that had the highest CGIS, so clinician rated severity at year two. So that's just maybe suggesting that there were these kind of signs of maladaptive avoidance in this cautious decision making that then predicted this kind of development of anxiety. And so then, oh yeah, here. So then next I wanted to ask the same question, except ask about change. So instead of looking at, year one predicting year two, I wanted to say, okay, how does change kind of in this amygdala response during cautious decision making maybe interact with change in striatal response to predict kind of the change in clinical anxiety over time. And once again, we found a similar interaction where here the kiddos who showed the decreases in amygdala activation during cautious choice, coupled with increases in striatal activation, showed the largest increases in this kind of anxiety severity over time. So this was again suggesting that maybe, just focusing on the amygdala or the striatum alone really doesn't tell the whole story. It's more about how they work together and the interaction between these two regions. Yeah, and there again. Okay, and then there were no, actually, interestingly, there were no COVID-related differences in task behavior or anxiety severity. I found like a trend with those negative perceptions of decision-making where the youth who came in after COVID showed slightly more increases in kind of those negative perceptions. And then the only like significant difference we found was participants who returned after the COVID shutdown showed more increases in striatal activation during these cautious choices from year one to year two than those who returned before the shutdown. So not sure exactly what that means, but I want to dig into that a little further. Any questions? Sorry, I kind of zoomed through this. Okay, cool. Okay, so just some conclusions and future directions. So over time, in adolescents in this sample showed decreases in this kind of self-reported scared, increases in the clinician-rated anxiety. And then they also showed these increases in risky behaviors and false alarms. And there was no association between this change in anxiety and change in behavior, but the youth who increased in anxiety did show kind of these differences in these negative and positive perceptions in decision-making over time. Okay, and then in the brain, youth who increased in anxiety showed kind of more neural generalization between cautious, involuntary cautious choice and instructed inhibition, and less conflict, neural conflict processing during cautious choice, while increases in anxiety, increases in risk taking were associated with more of this conflict processing between cautious choice and more similarity between cautious and risky. And then we found that changes in anxiety were tied to changes in striatal connectivity with these regions during cautious choice, while changes in amygdala connectivity were associated with changes in risk taking. And then finally, we found out that responding of these regions, the striatum and the amygdala, interacted to predict kind of the development of clinical anxiety over time. And so, yeah, I can go through this quickly, but really, I think it's important to study all of these things together, not just study, behavior and decision making, and then anxiety development here. So here we found that behavior is multifaceted, and considering this reaction time actually showed more associations with anxiety than just the frequency of behaviors themselves. And then, yeah, we found that anxiety was did not show these, overarching associations with behavior. And as I mentioned, actually, approach motivations kind of interacted with anxiety to influence behavior. And then the brain is also obviously not modular. And so the same brain regions can produce different behaviors, such as like the striatum, as we talked about, and approach and avoidance. And so studying both of these together when studying adolescent development is really important to fully capture this developmental change. And then also just a quick thing at the end, this multivariate analysis would considering kind of the patterns of brain activation, and might be a promising approach for understanding how the adolescent brain kind of generalizes across or distinguishes between different decision scenarios that involve different varying levels of, risk, reward, approach, avoidance, conflict. And as I mentioned before, this task, I think the biggest issue here is just the amount of trials. And so I think it would be really great. I really want to kind of look at some of these questions in bigger data sets, such as the ABCD data set, and see if I can replicate some of these things, some of these findings when using more subjects and more data, because obviously, reliability is a big issue in the neuroimaging field, and the more we can get, the better. So yes, that is it.
Very nice presentation, very clear presentation of very complicated results.
Thank you.
Let's have questions or comments.
So why do you think the clinician and the self-reports are so different, and yet they both do things?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I think looking at that third time point will just tell a lot more, because there's this, you could go down a bit, but then you could go right back up, you could go up a bit and then right back down. So it's really important to kind of measure that curve there. So here I think I'm getting at something here, but I think that that discrepancy there makes it a little harder to interpret the results. I also think, I think maybe there's different parts. I feel like, Katie, more just about what you can pick up in an interview versus what you can pick up from a self-report, and maybe there's different aspects of anxiety that some are getting at, that one is getting at and the other isn't.
Yeah, I think one piece, like I mentioned before, is just level of insight. Scared is supposed to be better at pulling information that children and adolescents can understand and can recognize principles, but it does require a certain level of insight into their behavior and how their anxiety may be impacting their daily life and what they're not able to do with that anxiety kind of thing. And then the CGI is really good at, the clinician-based interviews are really good at better understanding functional impairment of these things. So what behaviors is the kid unable to do because the anxiety is so bad that they avoid or they inappropriately approach certain things. So I feel like the CGI is not only getting at that functional impairment aspect, but also what the parent is able to afford that perhaps kid is not noticing or not able or not willing at times.
Yes, yeah, totally. And I think that's such an interesting point here, where there's this idea that, anxiety, people who struggle with anxiety or adolescents who struggle with anxiety probably aren't taking risks. There's other things to worry about, but they might not be, showing these externalizing behaviors. But at least for me, when I was an adolescent, the anxiety, approach, just kind of maladaptive approach, can be a form of avoidance, because then you don't think about it too much. It's like, I'm just going to do it, and then I'm going to get feedback, or then I'm going to feel something or whatever. And so that is something really interesting we're finding in this data, that there's these kind of two different types of two different ways anxiety can manifest in behavior, either kind of automatic avoidance or kind of maladaptive, just automatic approach. But those might be both kind of in the brain, similar types, similar strategies, kind of to get out of the decision-making situation.
You know what that just reminded me of as well, is this, I wouldn't say burgeoning, it's been around for a bit, but it's definitely increasing literature on how anxiety is a normal part of life. And going to therapy to reduce your anxiety doesn't really make a ton of sense. The idea is more so, especially in like ACT models, of reducing your avoidance of things that you want, that are values consistent for your life. So like for a lot of kids, that would be going to school, regardless of their anxiety level, or finishing their homework, regardless of their anxiety level, or making a new friend, regardless of their anxiety level. So just the fact of having anxiety isn't necessarily problematic in and of itself.
Well, isn't it adults, isn't it like there's generalized anxiety and social anxiety and all that? Do you not tease that apart at this age, or what does that?
Oh, yeah,
They do like much.
Yeah, so there are different categories of all this, which is really interesting to look at too. And I think, for example, like the significant school avoidance one, that was the one that was most tightly correlating with that kind of neural generalization across cautious and inhibition, which I thought was really interesting, you know, the real life avoidance. And then the generalized anxiety also showed associations, but then things like separation anxiety, you could see how that might show very different associations, because that's more about not wanting to, you know, leave your parents in your home. And then when you're looking at adolescence, yeah, exactly. And we say, you know, like, oh, we often think like, oh, adolescents get anxious, but in a lot of ways, I'm guessing, you know, separation anxiety tends to go down a lot during that time, while the other things might be going up. So, yeah, that's really interesting to look at too. And I'm gonna go further into that. It would also be interesting if some parts of, you know, one of those areas, you know, maybe was better, more reliable in self-report or something than others. So yeah.
Yeah, and so for all of you working on this data set, I was curious about, well, both, you know, whether and how much resting state fMRI was collected, and what sort of sampling was there on the intake? Is it like you're trying to get kids who are high?
Yes, yeah, sorry, I should have gone further into that. So we got resting state alongside the tasks. It was you know, one of those where if we run out of time, that's what's cut, but we do have it on a good portion of the participants. So in my like aim 2 of my dissertation, I also looked at some stuff with resting state there, just to kind of look at it both in task and resting, and that's just always interesting. And then when we were recruiting, we really tried to get, like, the aim was to get adolescents or early kiddos who were kind of on the cusp of anxiety, but not quite there. So they were trying to, you know, in the grant, they kind of so that they would try to oversample from those youth who get the three diagnosis on the ADIS, because that kind of means you're almost there, but not quite there. And if we look at the scared breakdown from year 1, we did a pretty good job of getting, we have a lot that are kind of in the like at risk for anxiety group, and then a pretty good spread other than that. And at first we were really not taking anyone if they already, you know, if they had already reached clinical criteria on ADIS, but over time, we had a lot of difficulty with recruitment, because a lot of the parents who bring their kids in because they're worried about them being anxious, like, would be clinically anxious, or the parents just really anxious and the kid isn't at all. Yeah. And so we started including some like 4s and 5s in there too. So, but that was the idea, but we did have a lot of trouble with recruitment just because of that. I've never really done that approach where it's not, you kind of want people who are struggling with anxiety, but not clinical. And yeah, and so that's why, like, we had already started bringing back year 2s while we were still kind of trying to get more year 1s, and then the pandemic hit, so we cut off year 1.
Myra's got a question.
Oops.
It just,
Oh, I could do it on here. Oh, here it is. Okay. She said, okay. Amazing presentation is always, what % of youth got a clinical diagnosis between year 1 and year 2? So at year one, there were a couple participants who had like 4s and 5s, which does that technically count as like clinical level on the ADIS?
If it's, so.
Yeah, I
Clinical diagnosis requires specific symptoms, whereas the CGI is much more of like your functional impairment.
got it. Okay,
So like, so you kind of need both actually in order to get a diagnosis. Like GAD is a very different diagnosis, and I don't know if specific phobia was included.
I think it was,
Okay, but yeah, like,
but they're very different. Mhm.
but CGI is really getting at just that, like, is there like, are your behaviors and like changing because of it? And then there's also the diagnostic piece. So
Got it.
if you want to like put it into DSM categories, you got to look back at the ENIS.
Yes, okay, exactly. Yeah, because we had, one of the reviewers was asking this about one of our year one papers, and they were saying, here you say, you know, is anyone, we say like, this is the clinical threshold, you know, for disorder, but then in another place, we said like, oh, but none of them, you know, had full-on anxiety diagnosis at this time. So I think that's something I know we need to talk to you guys about and like really clarify too. But the CGIS did go up over time. So there were more of those, I don't think I included in here, but there were more 4s and 5s at year 2 than year 1, as far as the clinician rated goes. And then on the scared, it was like basically just a portion of that kind of high risk group just started, like at time 2, they reported, you know, really, really low symptoms, which again, we'll have to figure out, but yeah, that was interesting. You can try to collect a you know, an at-risk sample kind of, but then you never know what's going to happen.
So you'll have a year 3 when you can actually see even more conversion perhaps or something.
Exactly. So I think we have, year 3 is like almost, they're still trying to get it because of, you know, there was COVID and things got pushed. There were some straggling people, but it's getting there. They have a pretty big chunk now of year 3 in. And I know they also had, when the pandemic first hit, we asked everyone to complete a scared, and we had the parents complete, it was part of like a bigger, kind of one of those COVID studies, but a lot of the parents completed questions about, you know, how their household is dealing with it and how the participant is dealing with it. So I think Tara wants to look into that further, but that we have more kind of behavioral data there too from the start of the pandemic, and then I think 6 months into the pandemic, which would be really interesting to look at. And yeah, just from, because I collecting these data, it was just so like it was so kind of meaningful to see the participants come back after the pandemic, and you know, we're all now like masked and there are all these extra things, but so we figured like their anxiety might have kind of, just the anxiety about the scanner might have gone up. So we have a questionnaire just asking, you know, how much those additional factors, like having to wear a mask in the scanner and all this, was like making them more anxious. And actually a lot of them were like, no, I feel less anxious. Like I think they were just excited to be doing something again. Yeah. And it was fun to talk to them about their experiences. And you know, some adolescents were like, oh, it's totally fine, you know, I like just going on my computer at home, and some were like, it was terrible, you know. So so that's something that definitely is important. And at first it was like, I think everyone's like, oh no, you know, a pause in our data collection, but overall it's like, that's so much that you'd want to be tracking them at that time, and you'd want to be asking how they're doing. So and we also found that we didn't have, it wasn't like after the pandemic everyone dropped out, like people were pretty responsive too. And so I think part of it was the parents wanted that, you know, kind of free mental health treatment and free, just like the different things, just to check in with their kid and make sure it's okay. But I wonder how much staying at home during the shutdowns helped those who were avoidant, especially for school. Do you have any data on that? Like, did school anxiety go? Yes. Okay, that's such a good point. So that's what I was saying, that one like significant school avoidance category, that is where I really saw kind of the biggest pandemic related differences, where that went down the most. And I think I haven't looked at social anxiety, but even things like just, you know, just not having to wake up super early. I think sleep is obviously really interesting, and thinking about how sleep might have factored into these things. Like you now don't have to commute to school, you know, you can just get up and go on go to school on your computer, talking to my little cousins who were basically, I think they were 6th and 8th grade when it hit. It was like, or no, it was 6th and freshman year. And so my cousin who's in high school was so sad because she was missing out on all these things. But my cousin who was in middle school was like, I'm happy with it. It's like, why would you want? And I was like, I could see that middle school was tough. So so yeah, that's really interesting. And I've heard just anecdotally, like people who had issues with, bullying or just other anxiety, like really liked having kind of that access where you could write to your teacher and not have to be in that scenario. But obviously it was very dependent on like what your home life is like, and if you even have a space where you can live, and feel,
Yeah,
feel
this
okay.
was really timely for us, and there are a lot of folks in the lab thinking about doing projects on anxiety using ABCD data, like I know Charles and Priyanka and others have been thinking about it. Are there any things you guys want to ask since we're on the topic that you're all digging into?
We also categorize your subject into eye functioning and the functioning, like I have worked, how is it visually? So like the look at different groups, a lot of study is on high functioning autistic kids. So I was wondering that avoidance is something that might be effective when we look at 2 different groups.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And actually that was one of the main things that for the year 1 papers, one of them that I submitted, the reviewers were like, try, what if you try grouping it into on the scared, there's a certain cutoff that's kind of like at risk, and then a cutoff that's kind of like, okay, you might have an anxiety disorder. So grouping it by that instead. And with the brain results I found at year 1, they actually just got stronger when I did it that way. And I found a lot of the same things. I haven't tried doing that with the longitudinal, but that's a good idea, because it might be that, if once you group it, you're not as, it's not as affected by those kind of discrepancies by these different in these different measures. So that's a really good idea. But yeah, I thought I was looking at that too with the year 1 of looking at how like these individual difference measures might then group anxiety. So like if you're high anxiety, but you have really high approach motivations and you really are, sensation seeking, maybe you're in this group. And if you, have high anxiety, but you really are inhibited and don't have those associations, you might be in this group. But yeah, it's a really good point. We kind of set out to be like dimensional approaches, which is important and offers a lot. But the first question the reviewer had was like, what if you just split it into these 2 groups? So I think there's pros and cons of both.
Yeah,
For sure.
I was thinking it would be easier to differentiate the 2 groups for adolescents, but in kids, it becomes pretty heterogeneous, and there are a lot of different factors which might affect, the way you categorize the 2 groups. So that was one of my concerns pertaining to my project as well. Like, how far should I go ahead with categorizing them further, or like, should I just study them all as a group?
Yeah, I think again, and probably you'll get feedback, like if you do it just the whole group, people will be like, have you categorized it? And if you categorize it, people will be like, have you looked over, as dimensional? But I think it's worth it to just look at both, and because they're kind of asking slightly different questions. And especially when you think about like, oh, I'm just thinking about symptoms and the symptom, dimensions versus I really care about whether they're having a lot of issues, in their daily life.
Feel like that's like exactly where the field currently is. You don't know which one is better. So you
I
gotta
know.
To everything.
I
Yeah.
know,
Well,
exactly.
Well,
There's
in-
5 models now.
Yeah, well, in ABCD, so the recruitment strategy is just get everyone, it's not like oversampling for any
Yeah.
particular thing. And then you also have they don't have this driving test, they have some other imaging measure. And I don't know exactly which anxiety measures they have, but I'm not sure if it overlaps with what you've collected. So what do you think you would do like with ABCD data, given whatever it is, it's totally different than what the day's, studies.
Yeah, so I would definitely want to look at resting state, and then with the task, I mean, this driving task, I kind of, it was like, okay, so when I started grad school, I was basically using some old data from the lab that used this task, and then I had also just started on this project, and they'd already decided it was going to use this task. So the task has a lot of downsides, and it was kind of the bane of my existence at the beginning of grad school. But over time, I feel like it had a lot of kind of strengths that were fun to probe apart, but I am not at all tied to it. I think other decision-making tasks that kind of vary the amounts of risk and reward, or just get at slightly different pieces of decision-making would be really interesting and informative too. And then with anxiety, I was thinking of doing it here, but definitely in the ABCD data set, it would be cool to do like a more kind of like latent variable approach where you're using multiple different factors to kind of assess anxiety, so that it's not so much as like one says this and one says this, but instead try to get a variable that just overall encompasses these different parts of anxiety. But yeah, I definitely with the resting state, I want to see if I can get to see some of the same things that I saw here, and then also some of the individual difference measures. I'm guessing in ABCD they have the measures of like sensation seeking or approach motivation, so it'd be really cool to look at that, and they might have different measures of risk taking than just this task. Like self-report risk taking is always interesting. I tried to look, we have some measures of kind of real world risk taking in this sample, but they were very young at the beginning, so the ones that have to do with driving, like really there's not a lot of people who
Are driving at 89.
exactly. And so I did see like a trend between risk taking on the task and kind of their self-reported how often they've driven without a seatbelt or driven like in a car with someone drinking alcohol, but so many participants just reported 0 of those things that it wasn't it wasn't too telling. But any substance use measure, yes. So in that question, that like kind of real world risk taking, it also asks tons about substance use. We kind of got in trouble because I guess first the form that was up was it was like the high school version, and so some parents were like, why are you asking my kid about all these drugs and all this stuff? So some of the parents went through and like, didn't let them answer certain ones, so we don't have total complete data on that. But I think at the year 2 and definitely year 3, those things will become more actually interesting to look at because they're just getting older and it's more prevalent. And then that will be really cool to look at with like anxiety and all of that. So yeah, we have a lot of those kind of measures. I think Adriana's other studies had mostly been in like 14 to 18-year-olds. So a lot of the forms didn't quite have the same effect on the younger kids just because they hadn't been doing as many of the things. But as they get older, it will be very interesting to look at, and looking at like pandemic related effects there too.
Actually, it's interesting because you might, with these longitudinal studies, be able to, predict things like likelihood for self-medication and all this, just because a lot of times, like, why you get all this drug use is because of the anxiety or because of the
Exactly.
or whatever.
That was like definitely me as a teenager. So yeah, I think in ABCD it would be really cool to look at too, anxiety and then the substance use, just because that's always interesting.
Yeah, no, there's a lot to work with here. Well, congrats on finishing your
Thank
dissertation.
you.
That's great. And so now you're writing fellowships and things.
Yeah, now I'm writing. So I defended in June, but then I had funding still on a fellowship until September. So I kind of just finished up stuff while I'm thinking. Now I'm like, okay, now I really know I want to. I think ABCD is just like the way of the future. Like just. We're also dealing with a lot of reviewers saying, the trials and the amount of participants and all that. And so especially with things like resting state, where you can easily get it in so many people, it does seem like that would be a really interesting and important next step. So yes.
Another one just worth keeping on your
Yes.
horizon is the NKI
Mhm.
sample, especially.
Oh, yeah.
Especially some of their like extra. There's even like a neurofeedback one that they're now doing with looking at like repetitive negative thinking, and so like they've got a lot more of those kinds of measures and anxiety kinds of measures.
Okay, interesting.
That one that I'm getting myself stoked about.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
We've done a lot with that sample, so if you're interested in it, talk to Jason or anybody.
Okay.
Lauren's done a lot with NKI as well. So.
awesome. Yeah, I think also just even within the task themselves, like the feedback that the kids get, like in this task, because they do, sometimes get rewards and crashes. So that's another thing at the beginning, I really wanted to look at kind of the effects of the feedback, but there's just not enough trials for that. But that would be something really cool to look at in the future too, of just how do they adapt their behavior and adapt their brain response based on the feedback they get.
Their brain response to negative feedback,
Yes.
you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, what I always get sort of hung up on when I read all this literature is that like all the, like for the, for the ABCD stuff, like of all the like problems that kids have, like a very small percent actually develop substance use disorder, a very small percent actually like go on to have issues with growth. I guess a larger percent go on to have some mental health diagnosis. So I guess like what, in thinking about like your sort of long-term career plans, like what sort of aspect are you most interested in doing? Like, is it mostly like predicting later, adulthood anxiety or later substance abuse issues or later whatever, or do you see yourself like focusing on the adolescent phase?
Yeah, I think adolescence is just so fascinating to me, and there's so much going on, obviously, and it kind of sets you up for the rest of your life, and is also like it seems like a very promising time for interventions and those type of things because of all the change. And so I really like focusing on adolescence and trying to figure out how these different things do kind of develop together, and then also how do these individual differences affect kind of maybe what kind of treatment or intervention or something would be most useful during this time. But then I do think it's important to then see who develops the full-blown kind of clinical disorders in adulthood. But yeah, I think my lens, I really like focusing on adolescence itself because so much is happening, and it seems like there's so much talked about kind of the risk and the vulnerability, but obviously there's just so much opportunity too. And so yeah, if I had a choice, I would like to continue focusing on adolescence, but with some with a nod to what's happening then later in adulthood, and how those things in adolescence then affect later in adulthood.
Yeah, there's plenty to be done in this age range, so I'm not suggesting that we move on, but it's also interesting that so many people focus on like, the top-down regulatory models of adolescent brain development, but I think if you look at like Bea Luda's whole line of work, she has like a whole different way of thinking about the prefrontal cortex and the subcortical systems that isn't so much about this antagonism. So I wonder, like, at other, thoughts about the brain models that we can bring to bear here, or if that's sort of the major one you're working with. Because if you're like derived from BJ Casey's lineage, then that's what you say about prefrontal and adolescence. But if you're not, then there's all these other models that people also believe in. So I'm curious that,
Yeah, I'm definitely not tied to and I think, this kind of just very, modular of like this top down kind of immaturity and bottom up excitation is just clearly not enough to kind of really explain a lot of the different parts of adolescence. And so yeah, I'm kind of moving away from in the more recent work I'm working on now, just kind of trying to focus more on like network models and not so much just in these regions in isolation, and kind of more in this like maybe generalizing across or distinguishing between or like flexibility and switching between things. So yeah, so I think definitely from just my experience so far, I don't feel like those modular models and just kind of the imbalance is good enough to explain much.
place to start.
Exactly, it's a good to. Oh, thank you. Yeah, exactly. It's a good place to start. And then I feel like also when you're starting in grad school and you're kind of trying to teach yourself these analysis methods, it's obviously easier to just be like,
Pick one.
pick one. And so I feel like part of my grad school career was kind of trying to figure out ways to expand that, but there's also much better ways to kind of focus on systems that, and not just measures. And so trying to learn more and more ways to look at it in a more like,
Well, this is great. I mean, I think this was a really nice presentation, a good way of showing how you can like take a theory and test it really, and it's always good to have surprising results, because what you're doing is pushing back against these like really broad theories and saying, well, really like the same regions, can act in different ways. And it's, not as simple as we would have hoped. But,
Yeah, yeah.
so, yeah, this is really, really nice, impressive work, and we're excited to continue seeing what you do.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for listening and for questions. Thank you.
Okay, so I think right now, I don't know if we have anyone who wants to present next week, so if anyone is interested or has, you know, anything preliminary they want to share with the group, get in touch with me. Otherwise, I don't think we have a speaker lined up for next Monday at this point. So let me know. I'll send out an email as well to see if anyone in the group has anything they want to present. And anyone on the Zoom right now, have anything they would want to present next week? I always hear from something you've done a while ago or something you're just thinking about. If you do volunteer, you can email me later. All right. Thanks, everyone.